Well, this morning's Gospel is one of those great stories where Jesus appears to his disciples, but their initial response is one of fear and confusion. And I like the way that they are so startled by his appearance that, they think maybe he's a ghost. They just have no real clue what's going on. Now, I like Johann's analogy that he appeared at that conference of, financial brains trust to talk to them about the environment and the needs of people. And they had the same sort of look of, perhaps a deer in the spotlight kind of. Sometimes shock does that. Sometimes when we have something unexpected, we just are dazed for a moment and don't quite know which way to head. And the disciples, we're told, were like that. They were dazed. Many years ago, it seems anyhow, Astrid put on a surprise birthday party for me, and she'd done it really, really well. I had no clue whatsoever. So I turned up to what I thought was going to be a small group at a friend's house, and I remember seeing somebody running and hiding behind a bush, like a few doors down the street, thinking, that's weird, and still nothing twigged. Went inside, and they all turned the lights on and shouted hooray and happy birthday, and for the rest of the entire night, for some hours, I wandered around shaking people's hands saying, oh, it's so good you're here. Oh, fancy seeing you. And I was just so blown away. I have, no normal conversations at all. I just didn't recover for the rest of that evening at all. And I think there's something like that happening for the disciples. You'll remember just before this, so it's on the day of resurrection. And the two of the disciples are walking away on the road to Emmaus. They're leaving. They've seen Jesus taken off for trial and beaten and arrested and all of that, and then put out on the cross and buried. And then it's this morning of resurrection. Others have gone to the tomb and seen him. The women have seen Jesus. They haven't heard that. They've decided, let's leave Jerusalem. This has just been awful and terrible. They're in this huge place of shock anyhow, and they're leaving. But Jesus appears to them, and he talks with them, and eventually their eyes are opened, and they're so amazed that they jump up and they run back to Jerusalem, straight back to where the other disciples are, and they tell them, Jesus appeared to us, Jesus appeared to us. And they're amazed. And so it's while they are still talking about these things, because it's at that time they're saying, Jesus appeared to us on the road as we walked and as we talked, and he was known to us when he broke the bread. And it all came flooding back, and we realised. And the other disciples were saying, well, the girls saw him this morning, and he's appeared to Simon Peter as well. And they're sharing these amazing stories that some have been in on and some haven't. And it's into that room that Jesus comes. And they're stunned. They just don't know what to make of it. And they're confused. And he says, again, touch my hands. See me. It's me, Jesus. And then curiously he says, have you got something to eat? And they rustle up, something for him. And so they share again in a meal. And in that intimate setting of sharing a meal around a table, I can imagine there's lots of conversation going back and forth, and lots of people whose minds are sort of blown, just trying to piece it all back together. But Jesus sits down and just eats some food with them, spends that time with them, lets them ask the questions and and we're told in their joy and their amazement, they don't understand. And there was something that I quite liked about that they were joyful. They knew this was good news. They didn't quite know how to understand it or what they were going to do with it, but they knew this was fantastic. And I wanted to pick up on that sometimes we can have wonderful joy without that understanding. Just by being in God's presence, we don't have to have all the understanding. Just like that story on the front of the messenger. Jesus isn't really worried about whether we believe just the right things or whether we can, repeat all of the scriptures and teachings that he's given, but rather he comes and he has a meal and invites us to slowly, in his presence, put that together. But I think joy is the right place to start. Joy at being in Christ's presence is the appropriate response when we realise Jesus is there in our midst. But there is something about joy that is a little hard to explain. I, in this week, have spent some time with an author of a book called Joy Interrupted. Oh, Jeff's laughing. Yeah, okay. We won't attempt to explain you, Joy. I hadn't even thought about that this morning. So this guy's written a book, Jeff Lilburn has written a book called Joy Interrupted. And it got that title because it's a biography, and he starts out talking a little bit about his childhood and feeling very out of place and actually struggling, even at that stage, with some depression. And then in the midst of, working out who he is as a 15, 16-year-old and really struggling with where he fits in this world, his parents sent him off on a holiday with, I think, a couple of brothers or whatever, down to a farm near Albany, Esperance sort of way. And he was at his uncle's place, and his cousin said, right, we're going fishing, we're doing this, and the other one went that way. And his uncle said, right, you're going to come and help me do some seeding. And he was roped into every day filling the seed hoppers and getting on the tractor and driving up and down the paddock and doing the seeding. And he loved it. He was a city kid, never done anything like that before. He just loved it. Every day he got up early in the morning and he started his work. There was none of this, I can't drag myself out of bed, I don't know where I belong in the world, what am I going to do with my life? There was something about his uncle's directive, you're going to help me do this, that just worked for him. He didn't have to tell himself or prize himself out of bed. He jumped up and he went off and he did it. And he filled the tractor and he got in the tractor and he went up and down, up and down, up and down. Now some of us might think, it's got to be the most boring thing for a teenager ever. But there was something about the purpose of it that he just loved it. And so he came home from a week and a half of holiday and says to his dad, Dad, we have to buy a block. We've got to get a little farm and we could grow stuff, we could get a tractor, we could plant this stuff, we could have orchards. And his dad just said, don't be stupid. That is the most ridiculous idea on the face of the earth. And the reason it's called Joy Interrupted was because for the rest of his adult life, he did all these other jobs, and there was something about that event that meant he never got back to that joy until he retired. And he was coming close to his retirement, and he came along a market one day, And he saw an old, I think they're called a shortwave radio, a Bakelite shortwave radio. Does that sound right to the people a little bit older than me? And it took him back to being 15 or 16. And he looked at this thing and thought, that is gorgeous. I'm going to buy that and do it up. Didn't work, but he took it apart and he cleaned everything and put it all back together, and it worked. He could listen to his radio stations, he could listen to music and talk shows and all sorts of things. He could get the news, and he thought, this is amazing. There was something about the Bakelite radio that just enthralled him, and he rediscovered joy. And he was sharing how he thought about, I'm going to buy a whole stack of these Bakelite radios because I love them. They just fill me with joy. And he thought, well, maybe I could make some money from fixing them up and reselling them. And he realised, no, nobody's really interested in these. There's a few collectors, but there's no money to be made here. There's no job prospects. There's actually no real purpose at all in this. He had a bunch of other radios. He didn't need this, but joy was to be found in this hobby, in this new discovery. And he realised that there was something about finding joy in that simple thing that was unexplainable, that didn't have an outcome, it didn't have a purpose as such. It was just joyful in itself. And he, being a theologian, he thought, well, maybe it's because it takes me back to my childhood days. And he thought, well, there's nothing all that specific about it. There's nothing that joyful about it at the time that was connected to that radio. But he was aware that he rediscovered something joyful in that. And so as soon as he retired, he bought a block in Chittering Valley and has set up a little farm. And he loves it. And so if you want to read his book, it's called Joy Interrupted. But it struck me that there is this lack of understanding about some of the things, some of the ways that we can have joy in Christ's presence, in God being close to us, that doesn't have an outcome, doesn't have a financial value attached to it. And we couldn't really put our finger on the reason for it. But the disciples, when they realised Christ was with them, sitting down and sharing a meal with them, they were overcome with joy. But they couldn't have explained it to save their life. But they knew that it was good news. That in and of itself, being in Christ's presence was joyful. And it's only after they realise they belong in Jesus' presence. Again, a little bit like Johan was saying, coming home after a long time away, about being separated, is something about being home, feeling like I belong here. That nourishes you, that nurtures you and feeds you at a deep place that you couldn't really put a finger on a name, why it is that happens for you, but it just does. And the reality is, Christ is that for us. Christ wants us to just be in his presence, to share that meal, that intimate space of sitting down alongside him. Does that for us. Brings us peace and joy and meaning and healing in ways that maybe we can't explain. But then as we sit there long enough, as we allow the time to touch us, Jesus begins with the scriptures and explains it all to them, and it starts to make sense for them. But first they belong. First they know they belong here. That Jesus is for them and accepts them just as they are. And then they start to behave. Then they order their lives and sit down at the table with him. And it's then that they go on to understand it. And he teaches them the words that they could become witnesses of what they have and share that with the whole world. Starting with right where they are and taking it from there to the ends of the earth. Remember, Jesus doesn't instruct them to go out and share a lecture. He doesn't go out and say, now you need to teach everybody this anthem or to repeat this confession of faith. But he instructs them to go out and share a meal. And to keep doing that over and over. And inviting people to that meal and join together with you and share some food. A kind of intimate leaning in close enough to touch and to see, pausing long enough to experience that kind of community that is grace and is joy and is the wholeness of being in Christ's presence. Made me feel a little bit like, hey, that's exactly what we were trying to do yesterday at our breakfast. Just sharing a meal, nothing, no speeches, no lectures, no outcome, if you like. Just sharing together, just being together. That grace and joy might flow. And then it might be reciprocated, that somehow people might think, oh, we could share something like that with our neighbours and our friends. I don't know if you've done that, but I know all of yesterday, or leading up to yesterday, I was thinking, oh, I should invite this person and that person that's not from church. That's what I wanted to do, because I knew we were going to have a great breakfast. I knew we were going to have a wonderful time together. And there was a bunch of people I thought, oh, they should be there. If I've got something great happening, I want them to come. So I did invite a couple of them. But I wonder if you could do the same. Not invite me. I mean, just invite 2 or 3 of your friends, 2 or 3 of your neighbours, and just share with them joy and grace. Just things that this world really, really need. And if we have them, we could share them. I think that's what Jesus would want.